It was a morning like any other on the Walker family farm, except, of course, for the faint but unmistakable stench of sabotage. James Walker, a man who had perfected the art of looking both rugged and perpetually annoyed, stood by one of his sister Emily's prized milk tanks. He sniffed the air suspiciously, his brow furrowing deeper than the Grand Canyon. Something was off. The milk didn't smell like milk. It smelled like a lawsuit waiting to happen. James wasn't a farmer by trade. No, he was more of a reluctant helper who had been roped into farm life after Emily inherited the land from their late father. Emily, ever the optimist, had turned their modest Texas property into a thriving dairy operation. Her cows were healthy, her milk was top-notch, and her land was the envy of every HOA board member in the county. And therein lay the problem. You see, Emily's farm wasn't just any farm. It was smack dab in the middle of what the local homeowners association, HOA, liked to call a developing community. Translation: they wanted her gone. For years, HOA board members had been pestering Emily with offers to buy her land, dangling checks so large they could have paid for James to retire early and take up competitive napping. But Emily was stubborn. "This land is my legacy," she'd say, waving off their offers like they were flies buzzing around her head. The HOA didn't take rejection well. They were used to getting their way with rules about mailbox heights and lawn gnome placement, not dealing with a dairy farmer who couldn't care less about their bylaws. And so began what James later referred to as the passive-aggressive war of 2025. At first, it was petty stuff. Letters about noise complaints from mooing cows, accusations that her barn violated some obscure zoning ordinance about aesthetic harmony, and fines for, get this, unauthorized odors. Emily laughed it off. "Let them fine me," she'd said, tossing another letter into the fireplace. "What are they going to do? Arrest my cows?" But this morning was different. This morning reeked literally of escalation. James leaned closer to the milk tank and gagged dramatically. "Emily," he hollered toward the farmhouse, "you better get out here before I call 911 and report a biochemical attack." Emily appeared moments later, wiping her hands on her overalls and looking as unbothered as ever. "What now?" she asked, her tone suggesting she'd already endured enough of James's theatrics for one lifetime. "Smell this," James said, gesturing toward the tank like it was Exhibit A in a courtroom drama. Emily sniffed cautiously and recoiled. "What in God's name?" "That's what I'd like to know," James replied. "Because unless your cows have started drinking antifreeze, something's not right." They opened another tank, same smell, and another, same result. By the time they reached the last tank, Emily's face had gone from mildly annoyed to full-on murder mode. "This isn't an accident," she said through gritted teeth. James nodded solemnly. "Nope. This has HOA written all over it." Now, James wasn't normally one for conspiracy theories. He left that to his Uncle Bill, who still believed Elvis was alive and working at a gas station in Nevada. But this felt personal. The HOA had been circling Emily's land like vultures for years, and now that she'd refused to sell for the umpteenth time, well, let's just say James wouldn't have been surprised if they'd hired a team of saboteurs armed with clipboards and bad intentions. "Call the sheriff," James suggested. "And tell them what?" Emily shot back. "Hi, my milk smells funny? They'll laugh me out of town." "Not if we have proof," James countered. And so began their impromptu investigation. A process that involved more arguing than actual sleuthing, but eventually led them to a discovery that would make even Sherlock Holmes raise an eyebrow. Footprints near the barn that didn't belong to anyone on the farm. Well, James said smugly as he crouched down to examine the prints like he'd just graduated from CSI, Dairy Edition. "Looks like someone's been trespassing." Emily rolled her eyes but couldn't deny he had a point. The footprints led directly to one of the tanks before disappearing into the woods behind their property. A woods that conveniently bordered HOA territory. "I'm telling you," James said as they followed the trail. "This has HOA fingerprints all over it." Emily snorted. "Yeah? And what are we supposed to do? March over there and demand they confess?" "Why not?" James shot back. "They're probably holding a meeting right now about how to outlaw happiness or something." Despite her skepticism, Emily let James drag her along as he hatched what he called a foolproof plan, but what she privately referred to as a recipe for disaster. The plan involved confronting HOA President Linda Harrington, a woman whose personality could best be described as aggressively polite and demanding answers. When they arrived at Linda's house, which looked less like a home and more like an HGTV set, James banged on the door with all the subtlety of a wrecking ball. Linda answered moments later, looking immaculate in her pastel cardigan and pearls, a stark contrast to James and Emily, who were covered in mud and smelled faintly of spoiled milk. "Can I help you?" Linda asked sweetly, though her smile didn't quite reach her eyes. "Oh, you can help us all right," James began dramatically. "You can start by explaining why someone from your precious HOA decided it'd be fun to poison my sister's milk tanks." Linda blinked at him as if he'd just accused her of stealing candy from children, which, knowing Linda, wasn't entirely out of the realm of possibility. "I beg your pardon," she said finally. "You heard me," James snapped. "Don't play innocent with us. We found footprints leading straight from our farm to your little Stepford Wives clubhouse." Linda's expression hardened ever so slightly. "I assure you," she said icily, "the HOA has no interest in your operation." "Operation?" Emily interjected angrily. "It's called a farm." Linda ignored her and turned back to James with an air of practiced condescension. "If you have any evidence to support these outrageous claims," she said primly, "I suggest you take it up with the authorities." "Oh, don't worry. We will," James shot back before turning on his heel and storming off dramatically. As they walked away from Linda's house and her judgmental lawn ornaments, Emily sighed heavily. "That went well." James grinned despite himself. "Hey, at least now we know we're onto something." And though neither of them would admit it out loud just yet, they both knew this wasn't over, not by a long shot. James Walker was not a man who let things go easily. Some might call it persistence. Others might call it a personality flaw. Either way, after their less-than-fruitful confrontation with Linda Harrington, James was more determined than ever to expose the HOA for what he was certain they were. A cabal of suburban overlords hellbent on world domination, or, at the very least, dairy farm annihilation. The next day, Emily found James hunched over her kitchen table, surrounded by a mountain of HOA newsletters, legal documents, and what appeared to be a half-eaten bag of pretzels. He looked like a man possessed or maybe just severely sleep-deprived. "Do I even want to know what you're doing?" Emily asked as she poured herself a cup of coffee. "Research," James replied without looking up. "These HOA people are slipperier than a greased pig at a county fair. If we're going to take them down, we need to know their weaknesses." Emily raised an eyebrow. "And you think you're going to find that in their newsletters?" "Hey, don't underestimate the power of small-town gossip disguised as community updates," James said, waving one of the newsletters in the air. "Did you know they fined someone last month for having unauthorized flamingos on their lawn?" "Flamingos, Emily. These people are monsters." Emily sighed and sat down across from him. "Look, I appreciate your enthusiasm. Really, I do. But don't you think you're taking this a little too far? We don't even know for sure that the HOA is behind this." James slammed his hand on the table dramatically. "Of course it's them. Who else has the motive, the opportunity, the sheer pettiness required to poison milk tanks?" Emily opened her mouth to argue but stopped herself. As much as she hated to admit it, James had a point. The HOA had been gunning for her land for years, and their tactics had only gotten more aggressive since she'd turned down their latest offer. "Fine," she said finally. "But if we're doing this, we're doing it my way." James grinned triumphantly. "Your way better involve some kind of stakeout because I've already got snacks packed." Emily rolled her eyes but couldn't help smiling. As much as James drove her crazy, there was something oddly comforting about having him in her corner, especially when that corner was currently under siege by clipboard-wielding tyrants. The first order of business was figuring out how the HOA operated. Emily had always ignored their letters and emails, assuming they were just empty threats wrapped in passive-aggressive language. But now that they were potentially dealing with sabotage, she decided it was time to take a closer look. What they found was equal parts infuriating and hilarious. For starters, the HOA's bylaws were longer than most novels and about as comprehensible as ancient hieroglyphics. There were rules about everything from acceptable shades of house paint, nothing too bold, to the proper placement of trash cans, out of sight but not out of reach. There was even a section dedicated to lawn maintenance that read like it had been written by someone with a deep-seated hatred for dandelions. "This is insane," Emily said as she flipped through the pages. "Who has time to enforce all this?" "Apparently Linda Harrington does," James replied dryly. "I'm starting to think she's less of an HOA president and more of a dictator with delusions of grandeur." Their suspicions about Linda only grew when they discovered that she'd been involved in several lawsuits over the years, mostly against homeowners who had dared to challenge her authority. One particularly juicy case involved a man who'd been fined thousands of dollars for building a treehouse without proper approval. According to court records, Linda had argued that the treehouse violated the neighborhood's aesthetic integrity. The case had been dismissed, but not before Linda had spent months dragging the poor guy through legal hell. "This woman is unhinged," James said as he read through the case file. "She's like Judge Judy meets Darth Vader." Emily couldn't help laughing at that, but her amusement quickly faded when she realized just how far Linda, and by extension, the HOA, was willing to go to get what they wanted. It wasn't long before James came up with what he called Phase 2 of their plan: gathering evidence. "We need proof," he said one evening as they sat on Emily's porch, watching the sun set over her fields. "Something concrete that ties them to the sabotage." "And how exactly do you propose we do that?" Emily asked skeptically. "Simple," James replied with a mischievous grin. "We bait them." Emily stared at him blankly. "Bait them? With what? Milk?" "No," James said impatiently. "With land." It took some convincing, and more than a few beers, but eventually James managed to talk Emily into putting up a fake for sale sign at the edge of her property. The idea was to see if anyone from the HOA would take the bait and approach her about selling. Sure enough, within 24 hours of putting up the sign, Linda Harrington herself showed up at Emily's doorstep. "Well, this is unexpected," Linda said with her trademark smile as Emily opened the door. "I couldn't help but notice your sign and thought I'd come by to discuss possibilities." Emily forced herself to smile back even though every fiber of her being wanted to slam the door in Linda's face. "Oh, it's nothing official yet," she said casually. "Just testing the waters." Linda's eyes lit up like a kid on Christmas morning. "Well, if you're serious about selling, I'd be happy to connect you with some interested buyers." "I'll keep that in mind," Emily replied smoothly. As soon as Linda left, Emily turned to James with wide eyes. "She took the bait." James grinned like he'd just won the lottery. "I told you. Now we just need to figure out how far she's willing to go." What followed was a series of increasingly ridiculous encounters with various HOA members, all of whom seemed desperate to get their hands on Emily's land. One particularly memorable moment involved an elderly board member named Harold who tried, and failed, to bribe Emily with homemade cookies and an envelope full of cash. By the end of the week, James and Emily had enough evidence to confirm what they'd suspected all along. The HOA wasn't just interested in buying her land, they were actively trying to force her off it. "This isn't just about money," James said as he reviewed their findings one night. "This is personal." Emily nodded grimly. For years she tried to coexist peacefully with her neighbors. But now it was clear that peace was no longer an option. "It's time we fight back," she said firmly. James smirked and raised his beer in salute. "Now you're speaking my language." James Walker was a man on a mission. A mission fueled by righteous indignation, caffeine, and the kind of petty determination that could only come from someone who had spent years losing arguments to his sister. With their evidence piling up and the HOA's true nature revealed, James decided it was time to take things to the next level. No more waiting around for the HOA to play their hand. It was time to force their bluff. "Emily," he declared one morning, standing in the middle of her kitchen like he was about to deliver a wartime speech. "We're going undercover." Emily, who was halfway through her second cup of coffee and entirely uninterested in whatever chaos James was about to unleash, raised an eyebrow. Undercover? What does that even mean? It means, James said dramatically, we're infiltrating the HOA. Emily stared at him for a long moment before bursting into laughter. You? Infiltrate the HOA? James, you don't even own a house. Details, James replied with a dismissive wave of his hand. Besides, I don't need to own a house to attend one of their meetings. All I need is a convincing disguise. Emily set her mug down and leaned back in her chair, clearly enjoying this train wreck of an idea. And what exactly is your plan? Walk in wearing a polo shirt and khakis and hope no one notices. Exactly, James said, ignoring her sarcasm. I'll blend in with the suburban crowd. Trust me, these people won't know what hit them. Despite her reservations, and her very valid concerns about James's ability to blend in anywhere, Emily eventually agreed to let him try. After all, if nothing else, it would be entertaining. The next HOA meeting was scheduled for Thursday evening at the community center, a building that looked like it had been designed by someone who thought beige was an exciting color. James arrived early, dressed in what he called his suburban camouflage. A pastel polo shirt tucked into khaki pants, loafers that he'd borrowed from Emily's neighbor, don't ask, and a pair of glasses he didn't need but thought added an air of sophistication. Emily had refused to join him on this particular escapade, opting instead to stay home and watch from afar via the tiny camera James had hidden in his shirt pocket. She'd spent the better part of the afternoon trying not to laugh as James practiced phrases like property values and landscaping violations in front of the mirror. When James walked into the community center, he was greeted by the sight of Linda Harrington standing at the front of the room, clipboard in hand and smile firmly plastered on her face. Around her sat a group of HOA members who looked like they'd been pulled straight out of a catalog for overpriced patio furniture. Welcome, Linda chirped as James took a seat near the back. We're so glad you could join us tonight. James nodded politely and tried not to look too suspicious. He'd spent years perfecting his poker face during family game nights, but this was an entirely different level of deception. The meeting began with Linda rattling off updates about lawn care regulations and upcoming community events, none of which were remotely interesting or relevant to James's mission. He tuned out most of it until Linda mentioned something about ongoing negotiations regarding Emily's property. Negotiations, James muttered under his breath. He leaned forward slightly, trying to catch every word. Linda continued, her tone carefully neutral but her words dripping with implication. As you all know, we've been working tirelessly to ensure that our community remains cohesive and well-maintained. Unfortunately, certain obstacles have made this process more challenging than anticipated. James clenched his fists under the table. He knew exactly what, or rather who, Linda was referring to. After nearly an hour of listening to Linda drone on about bylaws and budget allocations, James decided it was time to make his move. He raised his hand hesitantly, channeling every ounce of awkward suburban energy he could muster. Yes, Linda said sweetly, her eyes narrowing slightly as she looked at him. I was just wondering, James began awkwardly, about those negotiations you mentioned earlier. Are they related to that dairy farm on the edge of town? Linda's smile faltered for just a moment before she recovered. Why do you ask? Well, James said, pretending to fidget nervously with his glasses. I've heard some rumors about issues with that property, environmental concerns or something. Linda's expression hardened ever so slightly. I assure you, she said primly, any concerns we have are purely in the interest of maintaining harmony within our community. James nodded quickly, trying not to give himself away. Of course, I just think it's important that we handle these things delicately. Linda studied him for a moment before nodding. You're absolutely right, she said with a tight smile. Satisfied that he'd planted enough seeds of doubt without blowing his cover completely, James spent the rest of the meeting quietly observing and recording everything he could. By the time he left, he had enough footage to confirm what he'd suspected all along. Linda and her cronies were actively plotting against Emily. When James returned to the farm later that night, Emily was waiting for him on the porch with 2 beers and an expression that could only be described as amused exasperation. Well, she asked as he flopped down into the chair next to hers. "They're up to something," James said without preamble. He pulled out his phone and showed her clips from the meeting. The subtle digs at Emily's property, the carefully worded comments about obstacles, and Linda's barely concealed disdain whenever someone mentioned farming. Emily watched silently before shaking her head with a sigh. "Unbelievable." "Oh, it gets better," James said with a grin. He fast-forwarded through some footage until he reached a clip where one HOA member suggested using legal loopholes to force Emily off her land. "That's it," Emily said firmly as she handed him one of the beers. "We're taking this public." James raised his bottle in agreement before taking a long sip. For years they tried playing nice with their neighbors, but now it was war. And if there was one thing James Walker loved more than proving people wrong, it was winning wars, especially when they involved revenge served cold, or maybe lukewarm milk tanks. The next morning, James Walker woke up with a sense of purpose that could only be described as dangerously overconfident. He had spent the night plotting, scheming, and possibly Googling how to take down an HOA without getting arrested. By the time the sun rose, he had a plan. A plan so ridiculous that even Emily, who had grown used to her brother's antics, couldn't help but stare at him like he'd lost his mind. "You want to call the FBI?" she asked, her voice dripping with disbelief. "Not just call them," James corrected, pacing back and forth in her living room like a general preparing for battle. "We're going to give them everything they need to take down Linda Harrington and her merry band of suburban tyrants." Emily crossed her arms. "And what exactly do we have that's going to interest the FBI?" A few passive-aggressive comments and some footage of Linda talking about obstacles? That's not exactly a smoking gun. James stopped pacing and turned to her with a gleam in his eye. "Not yet," he said dramatically. "But it will be." Emily groaned. "I'm almost afraid to ask what you mean by that." James grinned. "We're going to bait them again. This time, with something they can't resist." Emily raised an eyebrow. "And what's that?" "A free HOA-approved mailbox." "No," James said, ignoring her sarcasm. "We're going to make them think you're selling your land to someone they really don't want as their neighbor." Emily blinked. "What are you talking about?" "I'm talking about creating the ultimate nightmare scenario for Linda and her crew," James explained, his grin widening. "We'll make it look like you've agreed to sell your land to a developer who's planning to build something they'll hate, like a theme park or a giant shopping mall." Emily stared at him for a long moment before shaking her head. "You're insane." "Maybe," James admitted, "but I'm also right. Think about it. If they think they're about to lose their precious aesthetic harmony, they'll panic, and when people panic, they make mistakes." Emily sighed. As much as she hated to admit it, James had a point. The HOA had spent years trying to control every aspect of their community. The idea of a theme park or shopping mall popping up next door would send them into a frenzy. "Fine," she said reluctantly. "But if this backfires, I'm blaming you." "Deal," James said cheerfully. The next few days were a blur of carefully orchestrated chaos. James created fake documents, complete with an official-looking letterhead from a fictional development company called Big Fun Enterprises. He even went so far as to print out mock blueprints for a water park called Splash City USA that featured garish slides, neon signs, and parking lots as far as the eye could see. "This is either brilliant or completely unhinged," Emily muttered as she watched James put the finishing touches on his masterpiece. "Why not both?" James replied with a wink. Their plan was simple. They would leave the fake documents in plain sight during one of Linda's inevitable surprise visits to the farm. Sure enough, it didn't take long for Linda to show up unannounced, clipboard in hand and smile firmly plastered on her face. "Good morning," she chirped as Emily opened the door. "Linda," Emily said flatly. "What a surprise. I was just in the neighborhood and thought I'd stop by," Linda said sweetly. Her eyes darted around the room, landing almost immediately on the stack of papers sitting on the kitchen table. "What's this?" she asked innocently, already moving toward the table before Emily could respond. "Oh, nothing important," Emily said casually, doing her best to sound nonchalant, but it was too late. Linda was already scanning the documents, her eyes widening with each passing second. By the time she reached the part about Splash City, USA featuring the largest wave pool in Texas, her face had turned an alarming shade of red. This can't be serious," Linda sputtered. Emily shrugged. "It's just an offer I'm considering." Linda looked like she was about to explode. "You can't possibly think this is a good idea. A water park? Here? It would ruin property values. The traffic alone would be a nightmare." "Well," Emily said with a faint smile, "it's not like anyone else has made me a better offer." Linda stared at her for a long moment before storming out of the house without another word. "That went well," James said from his hiding spot in the pantry once Linda was gone. Emily rolled her eyes. "Now what?" "Now we wait," James said confidently. It didn't take long for their plan to bear fruit. Within 24 hours of Linda's visit, rumors about Splash City, USA began spreading through the neighborhood like wildfire. By the end of the week, James and Emily had received no fewer than 3 anonymous letters begging them not to sell their land and 2 thinly veiled threats warning them of consequences if they went through with the deal. But the real payoff came when one of their hidden cameras captured footage of Linda and several other HOA members sneaking onto their property late one night, presumably looking for more evidence of the supposed development plans. The footage showed Linda rifling through papers in Emily's barn while another board member tried, and failed, to pick the lock on one of her storage sheds. "This is it," James said triumphantly as he watched the footage later that night. "This is our smoking gun." Emily nodded grimly. For years she tried to coexist peacefully with her neighbors. But now it was time for payback. The next morning, armed with their evidence and an impressive amount of righteous indignation, James and Emily marched into the local FBI office and demanded to speak with someone in charge. To their surprise and mild amusement, the agent assigned to their case turned out to be an old high school classmate of James's named Agent Carter. Well, Carter said with a smirk as he reviewed their evidence. "I always knew you'd end up here someday, Walker. I just figured it'd be for something illegal." "Very funny," James replied dryly. "So what do you think? Do we have enough to take them down?" Carter leaned back in his chair and grinned. "Oh yeah," he said. "This is gonna be fun." James Walker had always dreamed of being the hero in a dramatic showdown, but he never imagined his moment of glory would involve a bunch of HOA members being hauled away by federal agents. Yet here he was, standing on Emily's porch with a front row seat to the most satisfying spectacle he'd ever witnessed. Linda Harrington and her gang of clipboard-wielding conspirators being escorted off the property by the FBI. Agent Carter, who had clearly been waiting for an opportunity to flex his authority, stood at the center of the chaos, barking orders and looking far too pleased with himself. "Secure the documents," he commanded as 2 agents carried out boxes of HOA paperwork from Linda's car. "And someone get me a list of all their board members. We're going to need statements." Linda, who had spent years perfecting her air of superiority, was now reduced to sputtering incoherent protests. "This is outrageous," she shrieked as an agent gently but firmly guided her toward a waiting SUV. "I demand to speak to your supervisor." Carter smirked. "Ma'am, I am the supervisor." James couldn't resist chiming in. "Hey, Linda, maybe you can file a complaint about this with your precious HOA." "Oh wait, you can't." Emily elbowed him in the ribs but didn't bother hiding her grin. For years, she'd endured Linda's condescending smiles and passive-aggressive letters. Seeing her finally face consequences was nothing short of cathartic. As the last of the HOA members were loaded into vehicles and driven away, Carter turned to James and Emily with a satisfied nod. "Well, that's one way to spend a Tuesday." James grinned. "So what happens now? Do they go straight to jail? Or is there some kind of trial where we get to watch them squirm?" "Depends," Carter replied. "If we find enough evidence of fraud or sabotage, and based on what you've given us, I'm pretty sure we will. They'll be facing some serious charges." Emily crossed her arms. "Good. Maybe now they'll learn that you can't bully people into submission just because you have a clipboard and a superiority complex." Carter chuckled. "You'd be surprised how many HOA cases we deal with. It's like these people think they're running their own little kingdoms. James smirked. Well, this kingdom just got overthrown. Over the next few weeks, news of the HOA scandal spread like wildfire through the community. Residents who had once feared Linda and her board began coming forward with their own stories of harassment and unfair fines. One man revealed that he'd been fined $500 for planting daisies instead of tulips in his front yard. Another woman admitted she'd been forced to repaint her house 3 times because Linda claimed the shades weren't neighborhood appropriate. By the time the FBI wrapped up their investigation, it was clear that the HOA wasn't just guilty of sabotaging Emily's farm. They'd been running what amounted to a suburban extortion racket for years. The fallout was glorious. Linda Harrington resigned in disgrace, her reputation shattered beyond repair. Several other board members faced criminal charges for fraud and trespassing, while others simply fled town to avoid further embarrassment. The HOA itself was dissolved after residents voted overwhelmingly to disband it, a decision that James celebrated by hosting an impromptu barbecue on Emily's farm. "This is what freedom tastes like," James declared as he flipped burgers on the grill while wearing an apron that read, "Kiss the cook, unless you're HOA." Emily rolled her eyes but couldn't help laughing. For all his ridiculousness, James had proven himself to be an invaluable ally, and maybe even a halfway decent brother. As life returned to normal, or as normal as it could be after taking down an entire HOA, Emily found herself reflecting on everything they'd been through. Her farm was safe, her milk tanks were back in operation, and she no longer had to worry about surprise visits from clipboard-wielding tyrants. But perhaps most importantly, she'd learned that sometimes fighting back wasn't just necessary. It could be downright satisfying. James, meanwhile, reveled in his newfound status as a local hero. People stopped him on the street to thank him for exposing the HOA's corruption. One woman even asked him to autograph her mailbox as a symbol of defiance against suburban oppression. "I should start charging for signatures," James joked one afternoon as he helped Emily repair a fence on her property. Emily snorted. "Don't let it go to your head." "Too late," James replied with a grin. As they worked side by side under the Texas sun, Emily couldn't help feeling grateful. Not just for James's help, but for his unwavering determination to stand up for what was right, even if it involved some questionable tactics along the way. "You know," she said after a while, "I never thought I'd say this, but thanks." James looked at her in surprise. "For what?" "For everything," Emily said simply. James shrugged. "Hey, that's what brothers are for. Annoying you until you realize you need them." Emily laughed and shook her head. "You're impossible. And yet," James said with a wink, "you wouldn't have it any other way." In the end, their victory over the HOA wasn't just about saving Emily's farm. It was about standing up to bullies and proving that even small-town farmers could take on suburban tyrants and win. And if there was one thing James Walker loved more than proving people wrong, it was reminding them that sometimes revenge really is best served cold, or in this case, pasteurized. If you enjoyed this story and want more tales of justice served with a side of humor, don't forget to like this video, share it with your friends who've ever dealt with an HOA nightmare, leave us a comment about your favorite part, and hit that subscribe button so you don't miss out on our next adventure. Thanks for watching.